Verano.
Hola gente, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo están? Mi nombre es Diego Velázquez y estoy junto a...
Hola, estoy acá, Argel Bejarano de México. Estamos aquí en representación de la comunidad de Flutter en español y tenemos un evento. ¿Con quién, Diego?
Hoy día nos acompaña Fitz, es Developer Advocate del equipo de Flutter, del mismo Google, el cual nos trae una charla interesante que es sobre escogiendo animaciones en Flutter.
Sí, este tema va a ser muy importante y de lo que va a tratar va a ser de cómo hacer la elección correcta para realizar tus animaciones. En muchos casos es difícil o hasta confuso saber cuándo elegimos una cosa u otra para hacer nuestras animaciones, pero aquí nos dará el camino correcto para qué elegir y sobre todo, y muy importante, no solamente qué elegir, sino cuándo elegirlo, por qué elegirlo y cómo implementarlo. Entonces, bueno, no se lo deben de perder y aquí vamos a seguir.
Así es, agradeciendo a Google, a Flutter y a todas las comunidades de Latinoamérica que nos acompañan, damos pase a Fitz. Eh, let's go Fitz, good luck.
Hola, bienvenidos y gracias por venir. No dar toda la presentación en español, pero quería empezar así. Mucho gusto. Hi, and thank you for coming, everyone, and thank you for that intro video. Sorry about the technical difficulties, but hopefully they can keep us safe here, or not have not persist throughout the rest of our presentation. So let me just do a little bit of display management here for a second so I can get my actual presentation working. There's that one. Always technical difficulties. Perfect. Okay, we'll be talking today about choosing animation widgets in Flutter as soon as this finishes loading. Okay, hi, I'm Fitz. We'll be talking about choosing animations widgets in Flutter. I also want to give a special thanks to Emily Fortuna, our teammate, who helped build a lot of the framework for what this talk is based on, and a lot of the what we'll be talking about today. So sorry again about the technical difficulties, but let's get into it. So the biggest thing that choosing animations in Flutter, one of the things that makes it hard is there's so many choices. We don't have a clear distinction on what you want to choose always. There's rotation transition, there's default text style animation, there's animated position, there's all of these different kinds of animated things. And so the question then is, what do we do? What do we use? And so the question then is, I've got a vision. I've got this idea for what we want to build. What kind of thing we want it to look like, and we need to look at how we come up with those ideas. So the first question is, what is the idea? What should your animation look like? If you happen to be on a team with a designer and know exactly what you want, then that's relatively straightforward. So you ask yourself, is my animation kind of like a drawing? And the question, if you have like an animated penguin dancing kind of like this, or if you have some characters walking around the screen, then it's more like a drawing. And that way you want to use things that are more tuned to using drawings and animating things with drawings. And there's tools like Rive or Lottie or others that provide amazing tools for importing animations like this into Flutter. On the other hand, if your animation is more like the thing on the right, where you're actually working with containers and Flutter layout widgets and sized boxes and decorated boxes and doing transforms like this, it's totally reasonable then to use built-in Flutter widgets. So that's mainly what we're going to talk about today. We're not going to talk about Rive or Lottie. We're just going to talk about doing pure Flutter animations. And there's really kind of two different kinds of pure Flutter animations. We have this notion of implicit widgets and this notion of explicit animation widgets. And the difficulty of these kind of in some ways falls along this line, where we have there are things on the easier end of it with the implicits and things on the harder end of it with explicit and custom painter. And we're not necessarily going to go into that one, but the implicit animations here are things that they just animate. So if you imagine I have a container and I set its size, the implicitly animated container is going to look at that size and go from what it was before to the new value that you just created. And that's the implicit animation, where we're saying, I don't necessarily care when it starts or how long it takes. I just care that it animates to whatever the new value is. Meanwhile, the explicit animations are more our method of explicitly controlling when, where, and how long, and all of these things the animation goes. And so every little bit of it is defined. It goes when you tell it to. It can go in reverse. It can loop, and you are in control of all of them, of all those aspects. And so the question that comes up after that is, what are you doing for choosing explicit versus implicit? Which way do you choose on that? And there's a couple of questions. Does my animation repeat forever? So it just keeps on going for as long as you let it. And so this is an example on the left where it's just going to continually go. The other question is it discontinuous? And what we mean by discontinuous is that there's this notion of smooth values where it just always goes evenly between different values, kind of like a wave like this. If it's discontinuous, it kind of goes from there to there, and then maybe comes back over here and goes there, and then comes back, and then it comes down. And so maybe it doesn't go smoothly, it just kind of like the circle in the middle. And so the third question to decide whether you want explicit animations or implicit animations is, do we have multiple animations working together? And so with explicit animations, you can tie these things together. You can chain them together and build animations kind of like this on the right, where we have these multiple boxes working together. And the dangers of working from home, I left my door open. And so if we have this notion of multiple widgets animating together, then maybe we want to use explicit animations. And I see there's a question here from Amando. So we're watching the chat, and we're collating, or we're moderating questions. So please ask your questions when they come up, and we'll get to them as soon as we can get to them. Amando has a question: how good is it to have a lot of animations in the app on the same screen? Would it consume a lot of resources from the device? And the answer is yes, kind of. You want to be careful with where you put the animations and where they are, because they certainly can cause some problems, but for the most part, they should be okay. And we can look a little bit later once we get into the code what how you might be able to determine how much is happening on each frame, and that's going to be your distinguishing factor on whether it's too much or too little. So we'll get there. The short answer is just kind of think carefully about how much animation you're putting into the app. If nothing else, putting too much is potentially going to be distracting and just cluttering of the UI. And so that's one thing, and then the performance is the other thing absolutely to consider here. So now, after you've determined whether you're doing implicit or explicit, the next question to ask yourself is there a built-in, pre-existing widget for what you want to do? For both implicit and explicit, there's often both. There often is a widget that does what you want already. So in the implicit world, a lot of those widgets start with animated something. So animated opacity, for example, is an implicit widget that animates the opacity of something, how much fade there is. And using one of these built-in widgets is going to save you a lot of time and a lot of effort in figuring out, do I need to have an animation controller over here, and am I using animated builder or animated widget? I'm not sure. Let's just use animated opacity. It's already there. It works just fine. So check to see if there's a built-in widget for what you want to do first. And then we can get into actually implementing our own. And we will, just not immediately. And really, the takeaway is use the simplest thing available to you first. And writing a bunch of code is not always the simplest thing. Just using an animated something is often easiest. Okay, that's great. We have kind of a couple of questions to ask ourselves to figure out whether we're doing implicit animations, whether we're doing explicit animations, and eventually we end up just in the docs looking for a widget that might work out. And so we haven't really answered the question yet. And what we really are here for is to try to figure out how we make the app look good once we know kind of what we think we want it to look like. So we're going to dive into Dashcast, and this is where we're going to start actually coding. So I'm going to exit out of the presentation and go over to my code, and I'm going to go ahead and hit run and suggest while it's loading, I'll keep talking through what this code looks like. If you haven't yet seen on the Boring Show, we have a couple of apps that we're working through. One of them is this Dashcast app, this podcasting app that picks up the It's All Widgets podcast. It pulls in this feed and it builds a podcasting app. And so there's a couple things that are worth noting in this app from a code perspective. One is that we're using Provider to give us information about the episodes across the app. We don't need to know it here for this talk. Provider, briefly, is just our way of sharing status of whether the episode is downloaded or not, whether it's playing or not across the entire app. So that way we can have multiple widgets that can listen to that and maybe do some animations to see if things change. The other thing we've got here is that on the main page of the app, and we'll see this momentarily once it actually finishes building, fun fact, streaming and watching the chat and building on Xcode to get this to run is a lot of CPU. My laptop can't keep up. That list of episodes, though, is a list of list tiles. And so we're just using some of the fundamental basic widgets that we have available in Flutter, and we're going to add some animations to them. So we have our list tile, we have a title that is based on the episode's description, and we have our on-tap handlers. I'm really just filling time while the build process is happening. What I want to do here is that there's a couple of features in the app that are totally not animated at all. And what I want to do is actually animate them. So for example, this list tile doesn't have any animations at all. And this build is taking quite a bit longer than I expected. And again, if you have any question at all about animations, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we will address them, especially when we have these downtimes with Xcode just sitting here building. And if we could see this, we would also see that the list tile, one of the things that the list tile provides is we have the text in the middle that is maybe in this case the episode title, and we can also provide leading and trailing things. For this app, for Dashcast, we gave it a download control, and that download control is allowing us to tap on the image for the episode and get it to download. That image, however, isn't anything. It's just an image right now. You can see I've kind of put some scaffolding here for some placeholder code for figuring out what we're going to add to this in a second. But really, it's just the image of the podcast clipped to an oval, and that's it. So that's all our image is right now. And I see there's a question from Louise who asks, is there a dev tool for provider like Redux dev tool for Chrome? That is a question that I don't know the answer to, actually. But let's chat afterwards, and maybe we can find some resources for you. I don't know the answer to that, but great question. We got it. We got our code running. So here's our list of podcasts. And right now what happens if I tap on this image, we get the snack bar at the bottom that says we're downloading. That's all well and good, but there's not really any animation here happening. And what would be interesting to have is some sort of indication in the list that things are changing. And so, like, even in our dev console here, we can see, yes, the download is complete. Okay, there's nothing else that happened to indicate that it was complete. And so, a nice thing to do is to look at this built-in widget. Again, thinking about the simplest things first in order to provide some animation. One thing is that we could do is when we click on the download button, maybe that image kind of slowly fades away. So then we can get an indication across all of the episodes that the download is happening. So animated opacity. Let's real briefly, we can check out the documentation for it. It's a pretty simple widget. It is an implicit animation widget that automatically fades out or in the opacity of the widget. And so you can see an example, it just kind of fades it in, and we could also fade it out the other direction. And when you look at it actually in practice, this animated opacity just takes an opacity and a duration, and then what you want to have change its opacity. So it's very easy. It's a very simple implicit widget. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to take my child and is my keyboard not working? There it is. I'm going to wrap it in animated opacity. And as we saw in the documentation, all I need to do is provide it in opacity. And for now, I'm just going to leave it as 1 so we can make sure things work before we do anything else. And then I'm going to add a duration right there. So we'll get to what this duration is really doing in a second. But for now, I just want to have something there. Let's do 100 milliseconds. So save it. We now have our animated opacity there. I'm going to add another comma here so we can get some better formatting based on my font size. And so we have this animated opacity, and that's awesome, but it's still not doing anything, right? And that's because I have this opacity as 1. And this is one of the features of a implicitly animated widget, where it takes whatever current value you're at and animates to whatever the next thing you set it as. And so right here, we're not setting it to anything. We just have it at 1. And so I need to actually set it to something. And fortunately, down here, I have already written a helper method for us, which is getting the opacity that we want to have set based on the percent downloaded. So this is where our provider is going to come in, because I can get the opacity. And I'm going to pass it in the, we have our consumer here that is pulling in our provider for the episode. And what the consumer is doing is every time this value changes, we rebuild this. And so we can get our value, which is our provider, and have use the percent downloaded field that we put in there. So now, when I do this, and you can see some of these have already updated a little bit, but when I click on this, it's actually going to slowly update the opacity for that image. And there we go. Once it's complete, the image is fully opaque and is fully solid. And so I do want to mention the duration here is important, because we've set it, well, I've set it here for 100 milliseconds. And we don't want that to be too large in this particular case, because if our percent downloaded is increasing by 1% every half second or something, we don't want that duration of our animation to take longer than it takes for our percent downloaded to update. What I mean by that is you could potentially have an animation of going from percent downloaded of 0 to percent downloaded of 1, and you could have that take 5 seconds. But if the actual download of 0 to 1 takes more than or less than 5 seconds, the percent downloaded has moved on to 50%, but meanwhile your opacity is still kind of slowly catching up. So we want it to be short enough to be relatively faster than the download speed, but we don't want it to be too short as to be not noticeable. And so that's where this this duration has come in. So that's an example of using a very simple implicit animation widget. But there's one that's even simpler that we could potentially do, and that's using some of the built-in transition widgets. And so I want to take a step back, though. And one of the ways that we can make good decisions on where our animations appear and when our animations appear is by examining how the user is interacting with our app. And so it's a podcasting app, so there's really only a few operations that the user can do, and only a few actions that the user can take. I can click on an item in the podcast, and it takes me to the detail page for the podcast. I click back, I select a different one, I hit play, I hit pause. Oops, I hit pause too fast because there's a race condition. And that's pretty much what our options are as far as interactions go. But this provides us a great way to identify where we can add some pretty basic animations in. And when I say basic, I mean things that are not going to overwhelm the user with lots of interaction and lots of distractions on the screen. And so as I mentioned a moment ago, one of those is looking at some of those transitions. And right now we only really have the one transition. We go from episode list to the episode detail and back. That's what we do. So with that transition, we can provide we can wrap it in one of these built-in ones called the hero. And there are more transition animations provided by the material team in the animations package. I've not spent too much time with it myself, but it's a package that provides some really cool container and fade transitions between different things. And so if you want something else that's kind of built in, check out that animations package. But for now, this hero widget, of course, it's giving us an error because we forgot to, we haven't yet added a critical component of the hero, which is the tag. So the hero widget is taking us, providing us a transition from an item that we currently have to the detail of the item that we want to see. And here I'm going to provide it the name of the episode. So once my autocomplete catches up, I'm going to provide it the title. And so you can see now that we've actually provided the tag here, our reload works. I'm going to download that while we look at something else, because hero requires two different sides. We need one on the starting page and then one on the final page. And so I'm going to come over here. This particular set of code is the detail page for a podcast. You can see here that we have something up top called the episode image, which kind of mirrors that image that we saw from the leading image on the list tile. And here in the actual build of this image, we're passing it the podcast image again. It's going to be half the screen rather than that tiny little circle, and we've wrapped it also in a hero and given it the same tag. And so the way the hero widget is working is by looking for other hero tags on the destination, other hero widgets on the destination page. And if it has the same tag, that's the thing that we're going to animate between. And so I've already put it here. I've got the image here wrapped in a hero with a title. And on the main list view page, I have the podcast image wrapped in a hero with the episode title as the tag. And so now when I click on this, you can kind of see that we can get a transition between that list view into our detail view, having that image that is following us between the two pages. So it's a very subtle, small animation that we can add to provide some interactivity and some flair to our app. Okay, so let's go back to the slides. That's great, but we're still not quite getting into how we're writing our own animations, because so far we've just used the built-in ones. There's a case, though, for where we could build our own implicit animation. Okay, so I said I'm backing into the slides. Let's go back out of the slides, because when I have this download, I click on the download, the opacity goes, and the snack bar eventually goes away, and at some point in the future the download finishes. And when it gets close to the end, it's kind of hard to distinguish if the opacity is getting more opaque, if it's done, if it's frozen. My only indication is that I have this message in the developer console and the debug console to tell me that the episode has completed downloading. But it'd be nice if I had something else here as well. And that's where our case for a custom implicit widget comes in. And there's this relatively new widget called Tween Animation Builder that can help us do that. And so this is where our colleague Emily had the brilliant idea of maybe when the episode gets towards the end of downloading, so when we're almost done with downloading it, that once it does finish, it can the list tile itself can kind of wiggle around. Okay, so then we get some sort of other visual indication that this this thing has finished downloading. And so we have to go through our set of questions again to determine what we need to build here, because I've kind of given away the answer already by saying there's this Tween Animation Builder thing, but we want to go through our questions first. Is it like a drawing? So do we need to use something like Rive or Lottie to do these complex animations? And I don't think so, because we're still just operating on a list tile. We're taking a list tile and moving it around. So it's still just using built-in Flutter things. The other question then is, do we need to do implicit versus explicit animations? And I'll go back to the slides so we can walk through those. Where did my slides go? I lost my slides. Let's bring them back. So then we need to decide on whether we're doing implicit versus explicit widgets. And there were a couple of questions we had there and that we can apply to our list tile wiggling. And so do we repeat forever? No, because I just want it to wiggle a couple times and then be done. So it's not repeating forever. It's also not discontinuous, because a wiggle is just moving up and down a little bit. That's it. It's not restarting from the beginning and going back. And it's not multiple widgets animating together. It's just one widget. It's just that list tile moving up and down. So we don't need an explicit widget. Is there a built-in widget for wiggling a list tile? No. So therefore, now we can go forward a little bit. There's nothing built in, and so now we need to build our own implicit animation. So we need first two things. One is we need some way of generating positive and negative values, so that the up and down can actually, so we can transform our list tile up and down as appropriate. Okay, so that's the first thing we need, is something that can do negative and positive values. The other thing we need is a continuous function to get those values. And so this is part of that discontinuous versus continuous thing. I want to be able to just apply a mathematical formula to our current state so I can get that movement on the wiggle to be as smooth as possible. Fortunately, there is such a mathematical formula, and that's the sine wave. And really, it's everywhere. If there's nothing else you take away from this presentation other than maybe check out the sine wave for your next animation, then that seems valuable. So it's everywhere in all kinds of animations, in circular progress indicators and fading things so that they look kind of nice. And there's a variation on the curves, but the sine is a way to get a nice, smooth, back and forth kind of motion. And so it's really in a lot of different animations. So let's take a moment to review our sine wave for a second, because we're going to use it here in a second. Sine wave is really just it's a formula that we give it a number between 0 and 2 pi, and it returns for us something between -1 and 1. So sine wave gives us something between -1 and 1. That'll be important coming up in a second when we get to the actual code. Okay, I'll try not to close the slides this time as I switch back to my editor. And so I left a little hint for us here up top. We're going to wrap this list tile, because we want that whole list tile to kind of wiggle up and down a little bit. We're going to wrap this list tile in a new widget as soon as my autocomplete catches up. Alert wiggle. And this is not a built-in widget. You won't find this on our documentation. However, it is right here. So alert wiggle is our first custom animation. So all it takes here is the thing we want to animate, the thing that we want to have wiggle up and down a little bit. And so that kind of makes it an implicit animation, because we're not saying when it animates, we're not saying that it repeats forever, we're just saying that I would like this thing to wiggle a little bit when something happens. And so when we get into the code for it, we've got some placeholders here already. And the first thing we're going to do here is notice that we're also tying into our provider system. And this is so that we can tie whether this animation happens or not based on whether this episode has finished downloading. All right. So my to-do is giving me a helpful indication here that I need to wrap this in Tween Animation Builder, so we're going to start there. And of course we get some errors, because you'll see that Tween Animation Builder is expecting a few things. So it's expecting a duration, like almost all of our animations expect some kind of duration. And that's because we need to know how long the thing takes between doing different things. We need that tween, and I'll get to what that means in a second. And then we need the builder. Okay, so let's add each one of these in turn, and I'll leave the tween for last, because that one is going to actually involve some of our sine wavy things. But we do need the duration, and again, just like the last duration that we added, we want the duration to be long enough to be noticeable, but short enough to not outpace and to not feel out of place in any way. So I'll start with something like 200 milliseconds, and we'll go from there. So we got our duration. The other thing it told us we needed was a builder. Okay, let's see if we can get some. Now, when things are running slow, some things don't work properly. But we have this builder, and the builder takes a number of options takes the context, it takes the value that we currently are at in the animation, and the thing that we want to have animated. So we can call that the child. And if I actually have the colon here, maybe we'll get some information on whether this is correct or not. We're not going to use the context for this particular case because we're not going to really modify anything other than where this widget is on the screen. And so the very simplest thing we can do is just return the child. And of course, that's not really going to do anything much at all. And I'll restart while I'm talking so that we can get this to help us out. So that's not really going to do anything. We haven't given a tween. Because we haven't modified the child in any way based on this value. And so that brings up the question of what is this value? And that's where that tween parameter comes in. So a tween it's a play on words. It's just, it's a thing that can go between two different values. So it can start on something and it ends on something else, and it'll figure out all of the values in between those. So there's that tween word again. So we're going between 0 and 1 potentially. But remember the sine wave. That sine wave goes between 0 and 2 pi. So if we want to have this, this animation go cleanly from 0 through 0 down to -1 and back up to 0, if we wanted to have it go all the way, we can't just have this tween go from 0 to 1. We have to have it go from 0 to 2 pi. So let's start building out our tween then. It's a tween that is a number, and it begins at 0, and it ends at, unfortunately, there's a little bit of a helper here. We have our end value up top that we can just put in there. Right now we have it at 0, and that's because we want to look at, if I click on the download, what does it look like when we're just going, well, now it's going 0 to 0, so nothing's going to happen. But as soon as this download finishes, then we can actually see this happen. While that's working, as we just discussed, we actually want the end value to be in the range of 2 pi rather than 0. So the download finished here, and as predicted, nothing happened. So I'm going to change the end value to actually be 2 pi. So now this tween animation builder is going to start at 0 and go through to end value. And so let's click on something again. As it takes its time going up. But so it takes that tween and goes from 0 to whatever we put our end value to, and when that value changes, it runs the builder and does whatever our builder is asking it to do. However, our builder's not actually doing anything. It's not modifying the child at all. And so one way we can do that is with a simple transform. So if we're just looking at modifying where this widget is on the screen, we just want to transform it like up and down, for example. We're going to add some code. I'm going to create an offset where we use our sine function So again, if our value is something in that tween, something between 0 and the end value, which we've set to 2 pi, we pass it into the sine wave function, and that'll return us a number between -1 and 1. So that's going to be our offset. I'm going to pause for a second because I do see that a question has come in. We are asking, how can we define if an animation is so complex that it's better to use Rive instead of an animation in Flutter? That's a good question. And I think for me, what I look at is what is being animated. And what I mean by that is if my animation is animating components of the app, so text or an image or a list tile or a container, and it's not doing a whole lot with it. It's just like taking a container and making it bigger. It's making it opaque. It's making it translucent. Whatever it happens to be, it's working with actual components of the app. Then I'm going to lean more towards the pure Flutter animation widgets. If, on the other hand, I'm animating a character, like that dancing penguin that we saw in the very beginning of the presentation, if I'm doing like this animated character, like that is definitely not app components. If I'm animating something that, yes, I could write the code to do to have this drawing go, like follow a path or something, or draw this fancy logo that comes out from nowhere and has multiple color fades, and like I could write the code for that, but I don't really want to. There's too much visual things happening and too many things like going between each other, and so it's kind of a subjective answer. It's up to you on where you exactly make that line, but the core question is it more drawing like, so like cartoony and animated? Is it that kind of animation, or is it the movement of UI elements around the screen? If it's more like moving UI elements around the screen, then for that I'm going to tend towards more pure Flutter app animations. And they can absolutely get pretty complex, but as long as it's still just handling those UI components, then I'm going to be on the Flutter animations. Hopefully that answers your question. I know there's a bit of delay on the live stream, but feel free to re-ask it if I didn't answer it. So when we're looking at this alert wiggle thing, we've calculated the offset, but we actually need to use the offset now. And there's a handy widget that can handle this for us, which is called the transform widget. And transform on its own, it takes this thing called a matrix 4. And if you're not familiar with linear algebra and the like, then that can feel a little complicated. However, transform actually has a couple of named constructors. For example, we can rotate something by some given offset. We can scale something bigger and smaller, and or we could translate it. So I'm going to use translate because translate just means to shift it around a little bit. So for this, we need to give it how much and where to translate it, and for that it takes a offset parameter, and this is a helper class in some ways that can just tell us what proportion of the widget, of the child widget that we're passing to this, is moved around. So we can use our offset, Offset takes two parameters, and one is the X offset, and one is the Y offset, or the other way around, the X offset and the Y offset. It doesn't matter, I'm gonna arbitrarily choose to the, pass in our offset as a Y offset, and I'll do a ×2 here just because that sign function again returns something between -1 and 1, and if we just did that, like, it would probably barely be noticeable. So I'm going to make it a little bit bigger with a ×2, and then we actually need to have transform something, and for that I'm going to give it the child. So I'll add the comma, get some reformatting here. So let's try this again. There's a question of what happens when we don't dispose the animation controller. That means we have lingering resources out and about that we haven't gotten rid of. So that turns into potential memory leaks and potential resource leaks, and potential performance problems in that case. Okay. We also have a comment about asking if we can go a little bit faster. We'll balance that with making sure we get through the things that we want to get through. So for everyone who wants to go faster, there's probably someone who wants to go slower as well. So I want to make sure that we balance those a little bit. But thank you for the feedback. The last thing I'm going to do here on this one is to actually tie the start of this animation to whether the episode has downloaded or not. So I've reset my end value to just be 0, so nothing happens by default. But now that I have it tied to the episode download status, it was very subtle there. I probably missed it. I'm going to start talking about other things while I have another episode downloading. But it does kind of, right at the end of that download, kind of wiggle a little bit. Okay. I'm going to come back over here. I'm going to leave the emulator up there because momentarily this is going to wiggle. There it goes. Okay. So what we've talked about so far, we ended here, or we got to here, where we're saying that we wanted an implicit widget that just, it doesn't repeat forever, for example, like while something is happening, but it just does something once, and it animates something once. And for that, we used a custom animation, a tween animation builder to build our own implicit animation. But when we get to explicit animations, things are a little bit more complicated. So let's talk about that a little bit. And I want to run with the inspiration of that sine wave. It's again everywhere, but then maybe combine it with this notion that this is a podcasting app where we're having sound being played. And so maybe my explicit widget here could be a sine wave that's tied to sound being played. Okay, so here's the idea where maybe when the play button is pressed, a sine wave appears, and then we can move it a little forward. So it's kind of it's definitely custom because there's no animated sine wave, for example, and nothing is built in. So we trend towards therefore are custom explicit animations, where we're using something like animated widget or animated builder. What makes an explicit widget? Well, it's this notion of an animation controller. And animated icon is one of these, it's an interesting widget because it waits for an action, so like clicking on an icon clicking on an icon, for example, and then it animates it. So that animation controller is allowing us to tie the animation explicitly to something else. It's not based on some value that we're changing. It's based on whether we do something with it or not. And so what is an animation actually? Well, it's just a series of motion pictures. And this is where the tween comes in again, where we're going between 0 and some other value. And what we do with those values is really up to us. In that tween animation builder, we took that value and transformed a widget up and down a little bit. But maybe we want to do something else with it. So that animation that animation controller rather has a couple of different fields that we use to control animations. There's that value again, that thing that goes from 0 to some other value. And we could provide it anything we want. We could provide it a number, we could provide it a color, anything that can go between multiple different things, multiple different values can work there. We also have a status on whether this thing is running or not. And we have a set of listeners, so we have some way of saying, anyone who's listening to this animation, here's your new value. An animation controller is really just a subclass of animation. It's a type of animation that adds some control. So it adds some nice features like repeating and going forward, going backwards. It adds that control on top of an animation. So the animation works simply by tying into this notion of having a new frame every so often. So every 1/60th of a second, perhaps, there's a new frame. We can also call that a tick. And when we get that new frame, we update our value, we notify all our listeners, we update our status, so have we reached the end of our values or not? If we haven't, then we go on to the next tick, and we update our value, notify our listeners, we check our status, and we continue going. So that value is what we can tie into via one of these listeners to know what we need to do on the next frame. Because again, an animation is really just a series of frames that are going in rapid succession, that are happening very quickly one after another. And so all we need to do is have just a little bit of an edit on what's being displayed between each frame, and if we do that fast enough, we get an animation. Okay, so we want to be able to start and stop on demand, and we want to be able to draw something based on that value. So let's drop over to the code again, and we'll cut out of the slides, go back to the code. And I know I'm running over the hour time, but hopefully we can get a little bit of this shown. So let's go into the detail page here. And when I hit play, the stream was called on null. That's not an error I've seen before with this. Let's restart. Open up. Okay, so you can see here that the play pause button is doing its animation. So this was the that animated icon that appeared on the slides a moment ago, where we have this animation controller that is, we use it as part of the on pressed callback for the icon button, and when it's pressed, it animates, and it goes back and forth. And it doesn't show up in the simulator all the time, but you can kind of see it every other frame or so. That's one of our explicit animations. The other one up here is, if you saw earlier, we had this hero podcast image, and that's this big Flutter podcast image right up in 2/3 of the page or so. And then down here we have this animated opacity thing that's based on whether we're playing or not. Nothing is happening with it yet. So there's a little bit of a placeholder here that we start off with. And here, if we're using an animation controller, it has to be within a stateful widget, because that controller is not only state itself, but has its own state to manage. And so we need to be able to give it some indication on when our state is coming or going, whether we need to init, initialize, versus dispose it. So we have that controller. It is effectively our state for this animation. And so within init state, we create it. And here I'm saying a couple of things, that the duration, this is going to be a little different than the earlier durations where we were saying we need it to be fast but not too fast, and slow but not too slow. Here we're it's the same, but I want it to be now kind of the smooth, gentle flow of a sine wave, rather than something a little bit like the wiggle was, it wiggled and that was it. I want it to have to take its time going across. And the inspiration was a sine wave, so again we're going to 2 pi. By default, the animation controller starts at 0, so we can be explicit about it and set our lower bound to 0 as well. But by default, it does start at 0. We're also telling it that this will be the vsync. Now the vsync is providing us a way to say, to tie into a notification of a new frame is happening. And so we need to make sure that whatever this state thing is, it is something that can listen to new ticks. And so that's why we're providing this single ticker provider state mixin thing, so that we can be able to tie into these new frames. And so we've got this animation controller. That's great. And we dispose of it in dispose, as well as initializing it in init state. And within the build here, I want to again tie into our provider system for checking whether or not this thing is playing. And here's where our explicit control comes in, where we can repeat or we can stop, for example. And so right now I'm just returning a container, but here's where some of our explicit widgets can come in. We want to do, there's 2 different ways to build an explicit widget, an animated builder or an animated widget. The main difference here is whether you want it to be more on its own or more tied to things around it. If you want it to be more on its own, then animated widget is perfect. But if you want it to be tied to other things, then animated builder is probably going to work better. They both are effectively the same thing, and so you can use one in the other versus doing this one. But for now, we're going to use the animated builder. So start with our animated builder, and it takes 2 things. It takes the animation, and again, that animation controller is a subclass of animation. So I'm just going to pass in that controller there. And it also takes a builder. So this is a thing that is going to rebuild when the values change. So this takes a build context and the thing that we want to have animated. And for this, I chose to take a just like a blue container and clip its top edge to look like a sine wave. So I've already pre-built a lot of that here, where I'm taking, I'm using clip path to make that path, and I just have this blue gradient child widget, which is that blue blue thing, and now clip path also takes a clipper, and again I've pre-written this to help out. So wave clipper is a custom clipper that just looks at whatever, it creates a path based on a sine wave. That's all it does. So we're going to pass in the controller value and a set of points. Not going to worry too much about what those points are for the moment. Just want to get into this. So we're not quite working yet. And that's because this is always the fun with live coding, right? Does it work the way you expected it to, or does it not? So we've got this clip path, and it clips some points to a sine wave. Aha, so it's my init points. So the way this is trying to work is it's saying that at the very beginning we need some of those points to be defined. So right now we don't have, when we click play, so we can get that fade in and fade out, but we don't have those sine wave shape. That's because we've created our points from just the size of the widget, and so instead of that, what I would like to do is I've got to look up my snippet for doing this. Here we go. Here's my snippet for doing this. So instead of creating this list of points based on just the size of the widget, I'm going to create it, we'll restart, because I've changed my things outside of the build method, and so therefore we need to do a hot restart rather than relying on hot reload. And this init points is now looking at, or rather the sine wave. So the init points have given us more than just that horizontal or that angled line, because this clipper is modifying point by point, because we're going along the pixel the row of pixels along the top of that container. If you look really, really closely, there is kind of a little bit of a wave there. This is partially small because of our sine wave here. And the sine wave is, we just haven't made it big enough. And I'm going to just take this, there's this amplitude variable here already for us. And now you can see that we've gotten a little bit more, a little bit bigger. We're going to stretch it out by providing and making that period, that time that it takes to go from -1 to 1, make that a little bit longer. And then, since you can see kind of it's clipped at the top, it has that hard edge, I'm actually just going to move it down a little bit so that we get a nice clean wave all the way through. And so now we have our sine wave there. Which is not animating? No, it is not animating. That's because we're not using the value here at all in using our points. So if we have this clip that is turning the top edge of the container into a sine wave, we should probably actually base its position on the animation value so we can get it to move. And right now, if we look at making our sine wave, that animation value is not used anywhere. And so the way we can do that is, so instead of just having the position of this wave based on just that x, just that width, and again, I'm looking at my snippet so I can double check where we need to go. So if we now offset this a little bit by the, if you notice, we passed in this value to the this clipper. We can pass that in, and now we get our animation going off to the side a little bit. We can change the sign on this to go left versus right, but now that the podcast is playing, we'll hit stop and then play again to see that now we've got our animating wave going across. So to recap a little bit, we used our animation builder, and we have this controller which is generating values from 0 to 2 pi. And with that controller, we are building out this clipped path thing, which is just taking that top edge of a container and using that value to generate a series of wave points. And then we have an animation. Okay, so to summarize, to just close things out, and then we'll open for questions. In choosing which Flutter animation widget you want to use, the first question is looking at, is this more like a drawing, like that dancing penguin, like a character that we're trying to animate back and forth between things? Or is it more operating on built-in Flutter UI elements like list tile or containers? once you make that distinction, you can then decide whether you're doing implicit versus explicit widgets. And so a couple more questions to ask there on deciding that. And if you answer yes to any 3 of these questions, then you probably need to look at an explicit animation. So that last animation we were working on, for example, it repeated forever while the podcast was playing. And so if the podcast is playing, it repeats forever. And so that's where we ended up on with an explicit animation for that particular one. But if it were discontinuous, if we were starting from 0 every single time rather than going back and forth, then that would be a discontinuous, and then that would also lead us to an explicit widget, animation widget. Or if there were multiple things animating together, then that would also lead us to an explicit. Finally, check out to see if there exists a built-in widget for what you want to do, and lean more towards those built-in things first rather than going to something custom written. So that's really what we have. And again, thank you for coming. And again, I want to thank Emily for providing a lot of the framework for what this talk covered. But if you want to check out the code, it's in this particular tree on Dashcast, and I'll hang out for questions, and I'll leave this slide on. But I know there's again a bit of a delay on the live stream, but if you have questions, I'll hang out for a few minutes. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming, and please reach out if you have more thoughts after we close the live stream. We'll hang out for just a bit. We'll give it until half hour, until the half hour. So that's 11:30 my time. Yes. So you can get to the source code for this app in the Flutter Europe branch of Dashcast. And there's another question on why would we use custom paint, and why is it not recommended? So custom paint is super powerful. You can do all sorts of things, and a lot of very fancy and advanced animations are done with custom paint. So if you have something that can't be easily drawn with one of the built-in widgets, or offsetting another widget, or transforming it, so we have that translate or transform, the translate named constructor on transform. If you can't use one of those to get the animation to work as you want, then that's when you want to fall back to custom paint. And so the reason we don't recommend it, though, is because with custom paint, you are drawing directly to the canvas. You are controlling every single pixel on every single frame, and so things get very complicated. So it is certainly possible to draw every single pixel and the path and the arcs and drawing the polygons and filling them in the appropriate ways and having and doing all of the canvas drawing possible to get the thing to look perfectly right, and then tying it into the value of the animation. That is absolutely possible, and that's what a lot of, again, very advanced animations do. However, it's complicated, and so if there is, and so we'll go back to this slide, if there is some other way to accomplish the same thing, especially if you are just moving around UI elements or modifying UI elements, then that's where using Custom Painter is probably not going to be the thing you want to do. There's probably a some kind of animation or some kind of transition widget that can help you just offset a widget to get that animation going in the right way. In some cases, though, yes, you're doing something a little bit more advanced. You're doing something, or you noticed some performance issues with using the clip path, for example, which is what I was using on that last one. In that case, then yeah, maybe you want to drop over to Custom Painter. So I rambled on a bit, but I hope that that helped clear up a little bit. And a lot of these answers are really dependent on what the animation itself actually is. So that's where we came up with these questions to help guide which direction you take on this decision, because it's up to you. It's up to what your app is doing and what kind of animation you're building. But definitely try to lean more towards the built-in animations first. Another question here on, do we have any preferred resources to supplement the documentation in order to learn or see how widgets work? I think one of my preferred resources is to just open up the editor and pop things in and see what they look like. But that doesn't work for a lot of things. So I lean on the community to help out with this. I look at what you all are building and what you all are producing, whether it's through podcasts like It's All Widgets or Medium articles or other YouTube videos that people have produced. That's a great way to kind of see how things work out in real life. Otherwise, I find for me, just getting my hands on a keyboard and trying them out is often the easiest way. Some of them get a little bit more complex, and so that's where I lean on community resources to see how they work first. But I mean, we have the ability to write Flutter apps very quickly. So trying it out first is a great way, and then yep, checking out what other people have built is amazing. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you everyone for producing amazing content, for producing amazing Flutter apps. I'm at the half hour, which is about where I said I'd stop. So I'm gonna cut it here and say looks like we don't have any more questions. So again, thank you everyone for coming. Gracias, and I hope everyone is staying safe in this crazy world of ours. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you out on the internet.